Welcome everybody to the Zoom version of Melbourne Jewish Book Week, and thank you very much for our organisers for finding this creative way to allow David and myself to do our little gig for you. And let's see, so David has written a marvellous book, Defeating the Ministers of Death. As you see, I've read every page. And I thought I knew something about the history of pandemics and immunology and immunization, but I really don't. And David has written it in a most engaging fashion. But let me start with a little bio of David. So David Isaacs is a consultant paediatrician at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, Sydney, and the clinical professor in paediatric infectious diseases at the University of Sydney. Loves children. He has 4 of his own, as well as numerous grandchildren. I've forgotten how many. And 3. And he spent his career treating children in the UK, Australia, and in Africa and Asia. And he's witnessed firsthand the terrible toll on children who don't have access to vaccination. In 1974, one of his first internships in Africa, a ward full of children dying from measles, as well as disabled children with polio. David has also played a big role behind the scenes, helping Australia navigate the ethics of vaccination, serving for the last 25 years on every Australian National Immunisation Advisory Committee. So his book describes the pandemics that were the constant backdrop to life prior to our golden age of vaccination, beginning in the 1950s. Indeed, I think it was in 1964 that our Australian Nobel Prize winner, Macfarlane Burnet, said, we are on the brink of an era where we will see the end of infectious diseases. But certainly we were seeing the end of the pandemics that scarred all previous generations, going back to ancient times: bubonic plague, smallpox, diphtheria, polio, TB, rabies. So it was an age that we thought had passed. But this year, 2020, has shattered any illusion that the 21st century has moved beyond pandemics. In a matter of weeks, a bat virus has jumped ship and brought the whole world grinding to a halt. So had you read David's book last year, you'd have found the stories a fascinating window to the past. Now you read it as a guide to the present and a crystal ball of what may lie ahead. And what I'd like to do in this interview is take a tour of David's book by drawing on the vignettes of the past, and particularly drawing contrasts on how they resonate with the pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment as we track through the very predictable stages. And, I think David's book opens with a vignette of Abraham Lincoln as they're sitting down to dinner. It's a very somber affair, no music in the stateroom. His favourite son, 11-year-old son, is dying of typhoid. And Abraham Lincoln lost 3 of his 4 sons to pandemic diseases. Later in the book, we hear about Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, a very famous president, who developed polio in his 30s, but nevertheless went on to become president. So the pandemics affected everybody. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor or your social standing. So to start off, David, let's track a bit through the stages of a pandemic. For starters, who gets sick? And one of the things that really struck me reading through your book was the parallels between COVID-19 and polio, which is still in our recent memory. Could you elaborate on that and this crapshoot of who gets
Look, I'd love to, Ella. I'd just say one thing, though. you said it's as if a pandemic is a surprise, and I would say not at all. I think that infectious disease physicians, epidemiologists have been predicting the next pandemic. We've been waiting for it and planning for it. And we know, for example, there are regular influenza pandemics. So 100 years ago, one of the biggest pandemics ever, well, that's not quite right. The plague was probably the biggest pandemic ever, but one of the biggest ones within the last couple of 100 years was the Spanish influenza, as you know, in 1918-19,
yes,
that killed about 50 million people. About 3% of the world's population were killed. Unbelievable numbers of people. And there was a program about it on the television last night, fascinating program about how Australia was trying to protect ourselves from getting the Spanish flu. And the parallels with COVID-19 were really there. You know, you kept thinking about cruise ships coming, and these were ships coming full of troops from the First World War, and we were quarantining them at the in the quarantine stations in Sydney, trying to prevent influenza spreading to Australia, and it did spread in the end and caused a lot of deaths here, not as many as in America and so on. So we have been planning for some time for these, and the last influenza pandemic in 2009 was a pandemic. It just wasn't as severe as we had feared it would be. But to take us back perhaps to polio, and I think you were talking about the links between polio and COVID. So polio is a disease that's been around for thousands of years. There are pictures of Egyptians with withered legs and crutches, an old primitive crutch that are clearly polio. And so that's 4,000 years ago, and that was around. But polio was a problem right up until very, very recently. And so in the year that my son was born, my youngest son, which was 1988, there were 350,000 children paralyzed from polio in the world. And then last year, 35 in the whole world. So that's what we've achieved with polio immunization, but that didn't really kick in until the 1950s. So the great American writer, Philip Roth, who's died now, but his last book was called Nemesis. And it was written about a mythical outbreak of polio in Newark, the town that he was born in the Second World War. So he put it in there, and it's an allegory, sure, for Nazis and the Holocaust and so on at one level. But what he describes is the families who are petrified at the thought of this silent menace, because you couldn't see the polio coming. Silent menace, people would be paralyzed. And you talked about FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, being paralyzed. He was 39, but the most people who were paralyzed were children. In fact, one of the other names for polio is infantile paralysis. So it hit very young children, and it was a nightmare. Babies would end up in iron lungs. They couldn't breathe. There were no ventilators as such. You didn't have tubes to put down as we would nowadays, but they ventilated these little babies with iron lungs. And that's because their respiratory muscles were paralyzed, so they couldn't breathe. And if you were lucky, your muscles started working a bit and you got out of the iron lung. But some people stayed in iron lungs for 60 years, spent the rest of their life in an iron lung. And there are wards full of people in iron lungs. There are pictures of just whole wards in San Francisco of 50, 60 people in iron lungs all lined up. Absolutely horrible pictures, but chilling pictures. And this swept through a community. And children would die, but more often they'd be left paralyzed for life.
And yet you say that only 1 in 200 people would be affected by polio. So that was the thing that struck me as the parallel with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that the vast majority of people are unaffected by it. What is this sort of capricious nature of who gets infected and who doesn't? Do we know more about that?
Yeah, no, look, that's a really good point, Ella. And when I talk to families, they say, why did my child get sick? And I say to them, there are 3 things. that we talk about. We talk about the environment. Is it the right situation to get it? You can't get malaria in England because the malaria parasites, mosquitoes aren't around there to bite you, and so on. And so that's the environment, if you like. And then there's the bug itself. What's that like? And some bugs are nastier than others. And it's not really in the interests of a bug, evolutionarily speaking, to kill its host. That's not a terribly good way, because then the bug doesn't survive. So they want you to stay alive, really. And killing your host is a bit of an accident for a bug, even a virus that hasn't got a brain. And then the third thing is the host. Is there something about the host that is different? And so there are genetic factors at play that seem to be in play in all sorts of diseases, and in particular in COVID, so that younger people occasionally get very sick with COVID. Most are fine. And that seems to be something about your immune response to the virus. And interestingly, there are parallels there. I'm going to jump away from polio now for a second, which was a horrible disease, but I'm going to take you back to the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, because interestingly, polio affected mainly children. And you say, all right, children, their immune system's not as good. They've never seen the virus before. That's what you'd expect. Normally, influenza affects children. If you want to stop an outbreak of influenza, you close schools, because school children catch it and spread it. But the Spanish flu killed young people, 20s, 30s, 40s. It didn't so much kill the young and the elderly, who have the worst immune systems. It killed the people with the strongest immune system.
Yes.
And that, we think, is because some of them, not huge number, but a proportion of them, they had an overactive immune response to the Spanish influenza. And so not only did they get the virus, but their host immune response was out of control and killed them.
Causing pneumonia.
Yeah, and we think, well, they had pneumonia because the influenza is a pneumonia virus, and so's the coronavirus is a respiratory virus. But most respiratory viruses give you a cold, but not a pneumonia. But COVID and SARS is another coronavirus. That's why it's called SARS-CoV-2. And SARS and SARS-CoV-2 are cousins, okay? And they can cause pneumonia, but a lot of the damage is done by your body trying to get rid of the virus. It actually causes problems. You produce a vigorous response with the cells producing toxins and so on of your own that can really do you a huge amount of damage. So there's a parallel between the Spanish influenza 100 years ago and COVID-19 now. And there's another interesting parallel, actually, not on the vaccine front here, but that when influenza hit United States, the mayor of Philadelphia said, rubbish, nothing to worry about. We're going to have a street party and raise money for war bonds. And so he went ahead with this parade through the streets of Philadelphia. And absolute people dying from influenza. And the mayor of St. Louis heard that, so a huge peak of people with influenza. The mayor of St. Louis heard that and said, no way is that happening in St. Louis. And he introduced social distancing. People were to keep away from each other. He shut down schools and so on, and they smoothed the curve. And so the flattening of the curve that everyone talks about now is more than 100 years old. That happened in 1918-19.
Yes.
So lessons from pandemics we learned, and we forget about at our peril.
Yes. So in the days before immunization, how did pandemics end? Why did the Spanish flu end?
Yeah, you know, I was trying to find that out. And people were saying about 20% of the population got Spanish flu. Well, one of the things is, an epidemic will end when everyone is either dead or immune, when there's no way that the virus can pass anymore. But it doesn't have to be the whole population that's immune. So the calculations for COVID-19 are the same as for flu. They both infect about the same number of people. You have to have about 60% of your population infected or immune through a vaccine before the virus can't spread anymore. It hasn't got enough people to spread to. So 60%. And so either 60% were infected and nobody knew it because they didn't have antibody tests in those days, so that more people had subclinical infection or were asymptomatic, very mild or asymptomatic, than anyone realized. That's one way. Or sometimes viruses just go for some reason. So SARS was able to be stopped without getting a vaccine by being able to detect people who'd got it, because you didn't become infectious until you were very sick with SARS. And so SARS was a horrible, horrible disease in Hong Kong and mainland China, Taiwan and places. That's why they did so well with SARS-CoV-2, is because they acted very quickly, because they had horrible numbers of deaths, but they only had about 8,000 cases in total of SARS before it died out. We never got to use a vaccine against SARS because it died out, because people could identify cases, isolate them, trace their contacts, quarantine them, stop them giving them to lots of people, and could stop the spread that way. So that, in a way, that's how a disease dies out. So if you ask me, will COVID-19 die out? The answer is yes, I think it will. And how will the world cope with that? We'll come to live with it, I think. I mean, I'm basically an optimist, and I think we will come to live with it. As pandemics go, it's the worst one that any of us have known, because none of us was around in 1919. But we would have struggled in 1919 until we got a vaccine. We would have got one, because we can now get vaccines against influenza. For example, the 2009 influenza outbreak, okay, which was a pandemic, but no worse than flu that we get every year. So we get seasonal influenza every year. And then a pandemic is a sudden shift in the genetic material of the influenza virus. And that happened in 2009 and started apparently in Mexico, it seemed to be, and people have called it Mexican flu for a bit, but it's swine flu, if you like. And within a year or two of swine flu, we had a vaccine against it. And now there's still swine flu around, but each swine flu vaccine is in the influenza vaccine each of us gets every year. So yeah, the H1N1 swine flu virus is included in the vaccine. There are 3 or 4 strains in the vaccine of flu every year. I'm sure you've had yours, Ella, and I've had mine, and that includes swine flu. Yeah.
So the real reason that the COVID-19 is such a problem is because of these 80% of asymptomatic
correct
people who have
because
a mild disease.
You're infectious early before you've got symptoms, or when you've got very mild symptoms. So it's very difficult to identify the people who are the most infectious.
And that is that's another parallel with polio, isn't it? That people could spread it without being clearly symptomatic.
Exactly. So that's the parallel, if you like, the silent menace of polio and the silent menace of COVID-19. Scary, isn't it? I mean, as a thought that everyone... I tell you, though, interestingly, the infectious disease physicians are the people who are least scared by COVID-19. My colleagues and I are sort of trying to reassure people about it. All our colleagues are panicking, and the public's panicking. We're saying, no, don't worry, we'll get this under control.
Really? Why are you so blasé?
I'm not blasé. I think it's a very, very serious infection, but I do believe that social distancing works very well, that we can trace people, and that we've got a very good public health system. It requires an excellent public health system, and Australia has a wonderful public health system, and it requires the common sense or the good sense to see what's coming early. And I have to say that Brendan Murphy, the chief medical officer, really saw what was coming early. He got the best experts around him, and they really advised him incredibly well. And the government was obliged to follow their advice. When Brendan Murphy called it a pandemic, they had to follow that.
Yes. So moving on to a bit of the history of immunization.
Yeah.
And I think measles, again, is a wonderful case study, and involves two nice Jewish doctors, both American immigrants.
Polio.
Oh, what did I say? Sorry, I meant polio.
Measles. Yeah, so
I meant polio, right.
Yeah.
Sabin
so the development of the vaccine, the development of the
and there are parallels today, because they were rushing to develop that vaccine, as we are now rushing. We have 154 vaccines, like horses running down the track. And there's a salutary tale here, isn't there, about rushing with a vaccine?
There is. So, I mean, polio, as I say, was a terrible disease right up until the 40s and 50s. And then suddenly there was a glimmer of hope. There were two people really at the forefront of that. The first one was a Jewish immigrant called Albert Sabin. And Albert Sabin, his family came out of Poland from the pogroms against the Jews in the 1920s. And his family migrated to America, and he was based in the States, and he was trying to develop a vaccine by getting the polio virus and weakening it. A process called attenuation, which was first described by Louis Pasteur, the great French, not a doctor, chemist, but anyway, he wasn't Jewish, so we won't talk about him. We'll talk about Albert Sabin. And Albert Sabin was a great man, but then along came a younger man, and this young man was called Jonas Salk, and his family had come out of Russia because of the pogroms. And so another Jewish scientist, and the two of them started competing. And Albert Sabin wanted this live attenuated vaccine that you could take by mouth, because polio is a gut virus, so he wanted it in your gut replicating. And Salk said, no, that's too dangerous, it might cause polio. We should kill the virus and have a killed vaccine that you inject. So if you're trying to remember it, Salk with a K, the killed vaccine. And the two of them started competing, and
they weren't friendly. It wasn't a friendly competition.
It was not a friendly competition. And that may be why they didn't get the Nobel Prize, because they fought so much, so nasty to each other. It was really quite unfortunate. But anyway, I mean, a sibling rivalry, I call it. I think it was a form of sibling rivalry. And but what happened then was that the Salk vaccine was decided that's the way America was going to go. And so they managed to do a huge study where they gave half of the children polio vaccine and half of them got placebo. So a big randomized controlled trial, and the children, people really wanted, they were called polio pioneers, these children. They were all desperate to be part of this polio immunization study. And then everyone was waiting for the results of this study. And already they had lined up companies who were prepared to produce huge amounts of the killed vaccine. Okay.
And they had an active pandemic at the time.
There was polio around all the time, waves of it, not so much a pandemic, but epidemics of polio every few years. And they would wipe through a community and paralyze lots of people, kill some.
Yes.
Okay, we had them in Australia as well. And so what they then did was that they did this study, and everyone was waiting for the results of the study. Really, I mean, and it was going to be announced in grand style. And then as the study was being announced, with all the camera crews waiting and people on the roofs of the buildings, they already had a committee waiting to say, now we're going to make the vaccine. So they announced that the study worked, and the polio vaccine reduced the number of children with polio. And everyone was shouting, it works, it works. The trials were stopped mid-trial as people were listening to this news of the polio vaccine that worked. And immediately a committee was told, right, now you have to decide about the tender for these polio vaccine companies that want to make it.
How long did they have to wait to see that it was effective? Was it a matter of months or years?
Yes, I mean, the study took a year or two in all. And so they were given the vaccine at one point, and then they saw over the next year or so how many people got polio, and the results had to be blinded, and so nobody knew what the answers were until the end of the study. And so the study finished, they were waiting for the results, and suddenly there was this, it works, everyone was shouting, it works, cameramen on the rooftops and so on. And then the committee was told, now you've got an hour to decide whether you're going to give the vaccine to any of these companies. A process that normally takes weeks, they were told they had an hour to do it, because there was going to be an announcement later that afternoon, all planned, to say these companies have been given the vaccine to produce. And there were 5 companies given the vaccine to produce, and 4 of them were big ones, including companies that are still around like Wyeth, and one was a small Californian company called Cutter Laboratories, and the family was called Cutter. It was their own little laboratory, and people in the news said, I'm not sure that Cutter Laboratories really can kill the virus properly. But they said, no, trust us. And they were meant to go through all sorts of special tests, but because everyone was trying to rush this vaccine through, they cut corners. Anyway, Cutter. Anyway, Cutter Laboratories was allowed to go ahead and give the vaccine to people in California. And they gave about 400,000 doses of the vaccine. And within 2 weeks, children started to get paralyzed who'd received the vaccine. And then suddenly everyone realized there was a disaster on. And Cutter had not been able to kill the vaccine properly. So they were effectively giving children polio. And they gave 400,000 doses of the vaccine. 20,000 children got infected. About, I think I've got the numbers right, 40,000 got polio, of 200,000 given the vaccine, and 200 of those became paralyzed. So you can see 200,000 given the vaccine, 40,000 got the infection, but most of them were very asymptomatic or recovered, but 200 became permanently paralyzed, and 10 children died from this vaccine. So it was a disaster.
Yes.
But polio was so feared that they withdrew that vaccine, they checked it, the other companies didn't have the same problem. Cutter was taken out of it for a long while, and denied that they'd done anything wrong, and it was called the Cutter incident. It's a famous incident. And I think what it teaches us is, first of all, it taught a lot of people about vaccine safety, and hopefully nothing like that would ever happen again. But it does mean that when we're preparing COVID vaccine, we have to be very careful that it's safe. We cannot have a COVID vaccine that makes things worse, because you're giving it to so many people that if there's a rare side effect of the vaccine that actually makes things worse, it could be a lot of people that get that. You see what I mean? So I think my slight worries about COVID vaccine, you said there's 150 out there. It'll be difficult to get one that we know works and that we know is safe. And that will be absolutely critical.
So it's fascinating how people throughout history have done the risk-benefit analysis of taking vaccines or not. And we're all familiar, I think, with the story of Jenner, who found that milkmaids never got smallpox, and he realized, it's because they're exposed to the cow variety of smallpox, cowpox, which produces a mild illness, and off he went inoculating people with cowpox. But what I didn't know was that prior to that, and going back to, the 7th century in China, people were doing a procedure called variolation, which I cannot believe that they were, which
yeah, so variola, Ella, is the Latin name for smallpox. So variolation was, now people had got this idea that sometimes you might get mild smallpox and it would prevent you getting smallpox, the nasty smallpox. And so they had this idea that you'd take scabs of someone who's had smallpox and try and give a small dose of it to someone. And they would grind up these scabs in China and blow them up people's noses to infect them. In other parts of the world, in Turkey, for example, they would scratch them into the skin. So they'd get the old smallpox scabs from someone who's got smallpox and scratch it under the skin. And in fact, Jenner, that was done to him as a child.
Yes.
Now, the person who brought that back from Turkey was an extraordinary woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montague. And she was the wife of the ambassador, the British ambassador to Turkey. She was an extraordinary woman. She was a feminist, and we're talking the 18th century now. And she was a feminist. She'd had smallpox herself, so she had quite some facial scarring, although by all accounts, it didn't affect her love life too much because she wasn't entirely faithful to the ambassador. And but she was also fascinated by the Turkish women, and she'd go to the Turkish baths with them, which was very unusual for an English woman, a posh English woman in Turkey. And she'd go out there and she wore their costumes and so on. Probably she was the one who introduced the odalisque style back into Europe, and that Monet and others, you know, paint people in this odalisque style, Matisse rather, not Monet. Anyway, basically she brought that, she saw this variolation being done, and she brought it back to England and introduced it there, and that caught on, and it was used for a long time. And as I say, Jenner himself had variolation done to him. But the trouble was, about 20% of people who were variolated got smallpox and often died from it. So it was a pretty kill or cure, it wasn't true vaccination in the sense of it. And what Jenner noticed was that when he variolated people, because he was a country GP in England, in Gloucestershire, and he noticed that when he variolated people, that some of them got, the variolation took, and some of them got quite sick, but some people it didn't seem to take at all. They would just, and the people that included all the milkmaids. Mm-hmm. And he put two and two together, worked out about the cowpox, and then he got the cowpox material from milkmaids' hands. And quite famously, he did a lot of experiments, but the one that was really famous was that he had one particular milkmaid by the name of Sarah Nelms. And she had pustules on her arm from milking the cows. And so he got the stuff out of that, and he injected it into his gardener's son. So his own gardener, his son was called James Phipps, and he was 7 years old at the time, and Jenner gave him the cowpox to see what would happen. And he got a little bit of a fever, and then he was fine. And Jenner said, well, I hope that's protected him against smallpox. Let's see, I'll give him smallpox. And so injected him with smallpox. And James Phipps was protected all right. And he did it 20 times just to make sure that he was really protected against the smallpox.
Yes.
So, Jenner, I mean, wouldn't get past an ethics committee nowadays. But that, I mean, that was absolutely dramatic. So we're talking 1799, around that time, or late 1790s, that Jenner presents his results. He presents them to the Royal Society. Jenner, I mean, amazingly, Jenner is a member of the Royal Society, not because of his work on smallpox, but because he's an amateur ornithologist and has found out that cuckoos have a groove on their back, and the baby cuckoo hoists the eggs out of the nest using this groove. Jenner has published this and become a fellow of the Royal Society. But that gives him credibility, because the Royal Society is like the major scientific institution almost in the world at that time. So people listen to this treatise of his, it catches on, smallpox vaccine comes out, within a few years it's all over the world. So in Russia, the first child given the vaccine by Catherine the Great, she calls him Vaccinov and gives she calls the child Vaccinov and gives them money to educate this child. And Jenner's smallpox vaccine is introduced all over the world. Interestingly, it's not entirely accepted. So some people say this is very unnatural. This is going to cause people to turn into cows, and it goes against the church and so on. So quite a lot of church leaders were against it. And England did something interesting. because by 1850, they were saying there's not enough people getting smallpox vaccine. We've still got it, smallpox around. We're going to make it compulsory. And they introduced laws to make smallpox vaccine compulsory. And that caused a huge anti-immunization movement. So the anti-immunization movements have been around since the 1850s. It's not new. There's nothing new about this. And at that stage, Leicester was, interestingly, this town of Leicester in the Midlands was one of the hotspots of anti-immunization sentiment. It was a very poor area, and they said the smallpox is being caused by the vaccine, and we're not going to have it. And 80,000 people marched through the streets of Leicester carrying an effigy of Jenner and a child's coffin, saying, this is terrible, this is what they're doing to our children. And they refused to get their smallpox vaccine. They went to prison for it. And eventually it became very clear that the vaccine was getting rid of smallpox. And it became, the anti-immunization movement became only a very small proportion of the population. But the people from Leicester actually went and talked in the United States, and there was quite a big anti-immunization movement in the US, in Canada. So anti-immunization has been around there for a very long time.
So that's interesting. So in that period, you had two things happening: people willing to accept very big risks in vaccination in some places, like the risk of variolation, which I think you had a 1 in 50 chance of getting smallpox if you were variolated. And yet in other places, even when it became a lot safer, as soon as it became mandatory, you got this anti-vaxxer movement. And that seems to have really informed your sort of personal philosophy of vaccination. So I have to say that your book opens with another little anecdote, which is very confronting, of a child that died, a newborn, died of whooping cough not so long ago in Australia, because their sibling, even though the sibling had been vaccinated, the children at the school were not vaccinated, so the sibling contracted whooping cough and passed it on to the child, and the child died. Very confronting, makes me feel full of contempt to anti-vaxxers, and I would like to see the full force of the law come down on them. And another case you talk about, more recently we've had vaccines against meningitis. When my children were born, it wasn't part of the vaccination schedule, and I remember being terrified when they were toddlers of hearing about children who developed meningitis, and oh my God, how do I protect them? And then as they got older, the vaccines came on board and they were vaccinated. But you talk about, again, a child, a baby who wasn't vaccinated against meningitis, the HIV vaccine, who developed meningitis and developed cerebral palsy. Now, I just want to bring down the full force of law against these people, both for what they're doing to the community and their dereliction of duty to their own child. But you take a much more Solomonic view.
Look, my view about this, Ella, is that in general, we trust parents to make decisions about their children, about how they bring up their children, and about their children's health. And we override parents. That's because children love their children. Parents love their children, and parents have to live with anything that goes wrong as well. So when someone doesn't immunize their child and the child is damaged for life, whether or not the parents admit some culpability there, they have to live with the fact that they've damaged their child forever. It's no good punishing them for doing it at that stage. And so you have to feel sorry for the parents as well as for the child in all of this. It was a terrible decision. It's not one that you or I would have made. But you have to have some empathy for them as well as being angry with them. Of course, you can be angry with them, but you also have to have some empathy, I believe. And so what I say is, do you want to live in a society that compels everyone to get immunized? Or would you rather live in a society that respects parental choice. And if 95% of the population or more are immunized, there's very little circulation of these diseases, okay? And so in Australia, 95% of the population get their children immunized without compulsion. And we're in a very fortunate position to be able to say, in that case, why would we compel people to get their children immunized? Now, there are going to be a very small proportion of people who make what I consider very bad decisions, but the chances that any individual child will get meningitis or tetanus, you know, we get occasional cases of tetanus where people refuse to immunize their children, and a 7-year-old ends up in intensive care with tetanus. That happened last year in Byron Bay, would you believe, you know, where nobody gets, you know, everyone doesn't believe. And the trouble is that if you compel them, first of all, what does that look like? What does compulsion mean? In Belgium, they threatened to put people in prison if they didn't give their children polio immunization. And they actually said to parents, if you don't immunize your children against polio, we're going to imprison you. And the parents did get their children immunized against polio. So good result or bad result? You know, what then happens is that everyone doesn't trust the government anymore. They say the government is draconian and they force people to do things all the time. So my personal view is that it's better to persuade people unless there's a situation where there's a real risk from not getting immunized. And so I'll give you an example which actually relates to the Jewish faith. In fact, because in New York last year, there was an outbreak of measles. Now, measles is a disease that we ought to be able to eradicate in the world. And there's no measles circulating in Australia at all. If somebody comes from overseas with measles, 1 or 2 people in Australia who haven't been immunized might catch it, but almost no one else does. We've got this herd immunity that stops it spreading. But in the United States, in New York City, there was a pocket of an area where Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jewish people decided they didn't want any immunizations. So measles started spreading amongst that population. And then if you've got a fair number of people who are not immunized, you will start to get spread. And the immunization is not 100%, it's 98% protective. So 1 in every 50 immunized people might still be susceptible. And so then you might start to get people who've been immunized, that situation that you were talking about. Now, usually the immunization damps it down, it's not as bad, but still you're starting to say, those people are causing my child to get immunized, I've immunized my child, and they're being irresponsible. Once there's an outbreak of measles, the US came in and said, the New York state said, this is not okay. People are not allowed to travel around into the community unless they get immunized. And so they started introducing laws. You're not allowed to go into a shopping center unless you've been immunized against measles. You have to give proof or we'll not let you in. And so they started doing things that we would normally see as infringing civil rights, much as we've done with COVID, you know, things that you have to bring in for public health reasons, for the public good. And I think that's reasonable, but I just think that the compulsion or the laws that we have should be commensurate with the level of the risk, and that there is something to be said for respecting that parents will make choices, and we won't always agree with those choices, but that we should be hesitant to compel people and to use force, if you like, to compel them just because we disagree with them. And so in an ideal world, I'm with you. I'm a very, very pro-vaccine. I didn't go to write this book to be pushing immunization per se, but I do talk a lot about the moral aspects of it, the ethical aspects of immunization. And I do believe that compulsion, as it happened in 1850s England, can put people off. It can make people anti-government. And we want to trust our government. We want to be able to trust our government. as far as most things are concerned anyway, don't we? And so it's the sort of country you want to live in as well that I'm talking about.
Yes, yes. So you take a fairly pragmatic view. I mean, I know you love children, and you know, parental responsibility and rights of the child would be paramount in your mind, but I suppose...
Well, what I would say is that there are three lots of rights there, if you like. There's the rights of a parent to make decisions about their child. There's the rights of that child themselves, irrespective of what their parents decide. So parents can't make decisions and say, well, I feel like abusing my child and nobody will protect them. So we say, oh, the child's got rights too. And so there are examples where parents refuse to immunize children, and I say, I'm prepared to go to the law over that. And I have. I've taken cases to court where I think the risk to the child is so high. A mother who's got hepatitis B, chronic hepatitis B, and has a baby and doesn't want to immunize that baby, the risk is really high that that baby will catch hepatitis B from the mum and possibly get liver cancer later on. And yet we can reduce that risk enormously by immunizing the baby. And it's just a vaccine, a killed vaccine, perfectly safe. And so I'm prepared to go to court, and I have gone to court over cases like that, where the risk is higher. And I think parents are ignoring the child's right to grow up without hepatitis B, if you like. And then there's the rights of the other people who can catch diseases if people don't get their children immunized. And so the mother who says, like you said, my baby got pertussis because somebody else, whooping cough, because somebody else didn't get their children immunized. And so there's three lots of competing rights, if you like, and we have to balance them. And as I say, my general belief as someone who's a great believer in ethics and thinks autonomy is a really important thing, personal choice is really important, is that I don't want to trample on people's rights unless there's a really good reason for it. And then I'm perfectly prepared to say, yes, you've got a right to decide, but the baby's also got a right to live and to health and so on. But I perfectly accept that people like yourself might say, well, actually, the health of the whole community is more important than that person's idiotic right to not get their children immunized. And that's a valid view as well.
So, David, we do have a few questions. One of them following on, if a vaccine comes along, and I guess, we can all, we don't really have much basis for speculating at the moment whether it'll be successful or not. How do you think policy will play out as far as vaccination against COVID-19? Should the government make laws that everybody has to get vaccinated for public good so that the economy can continue? And
so if a vaccine came out against COVID-19, even people who are anti-vaxxers like Donald Trump will be fighting for the vaccine. There will not be a question of, it's a question of whether we can make enough vaccine. So lots of people are trying to get a vaccine. When one does, how do you make enough vaccine for the whole world? And that's going to be the problem. It's not going to be a problem of forcing people to have it. It's going to be a problem of getting enough supply for everyone who wants it. I think you would find huge demand. If the vaccine was known to be safe, I mean, there are already people queuing up to be part of vaccine trials. Yes. So I don't think the government will have to make it compulsory in any way. But this is an example. If suppose the anti-immunization movement had become so, and it's not powerful in Australia, but they make a lot of noise, but there are very few of them. But if it had become so that 10% or 15% of people said, I'm not going to get this COVID vaccine, the government might well say, well, for public health reasons, we're going to mandate that you must. And that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do if the calculations showed that you could get rid of the vaccine and get rid of the disease and protect people.
And you were saying we might only need 60% coverage to get.
Yeah, it might be that if you could cover 60%, you wouldn't get transmission. That's right.
Right, right. Another question we had relates to, the past centuries have seen us deal with the intellectual problems of vaccines and vaccine safety, but the last few decades we've had the ability to vaccinate children all over the world, but the economics hasn't worked for places like developing countries. There's a couple of wonderful examples you've given in your book of how things have changed. For instance, in 1974, when you were in that village in, was it Uganda and
Tanzania, yeah.
Tanzania, all the children dying of measles in 74, and how that has completely changed. And what was the mechanism by which we were able to get measles and the other common diseases under control in developing countries?
Oh, well, so, I mean, in terms of smallpox, for example, smallpox was an extraordinary story. So in 1950, the year I was born, there were 50 million people got smallpox in the world, and 10 million died. Okay, and then the World Health Organization said, this is not okay. And in 1967, they said, we're going to try and eradicate smallpox. And there was a great Australian involved, Frank Fenner, the late Sir Frank Fenner was involved in this. And they introduced smallpox around the world, and they targeted countries where there was a lot of smallpox. And so it got rid of Europe, fine, you know, rich countries, but they said, no, we're going to go for Africa and India. And when they could identify little outbreaks of smallpox, they would surround them with immunization. So immunize around them, a bit like herding around buffalo, if you like. And so they would immunize them by this technique of ring immunization, it was called. And so that it couldn't spread beyond that little pocket, and then it would die out. And from between 1967, I think there were 10 million cases of smallpox in the world. By 1978, it had gone, not a single case. And smallpox was eradicated from the world. Probably the greatest scientific achievement that we've ever achieved, if you like, was the eradication, certainly the greatest public health achievement.
And thanks to the WHO.
So that was the World Health Organization that Trump's trying not to fund, okay? So one of the great organizations in the world. More recently, there have still been, so because we use money as the way of deciding how we get vaccines, and there are vaccine companies, they will not make a vaccine against malaria very easily. Well, it's very difficult to make a vaccine against malaria, but there's an interesting example. You were talking about meningococcal disease and the worry about meningococcal meningitis, and there are different types, A, B, C, and so on. And there's one meningococcal A, meningococcus type, group A, and that really only occurred in Africa, and it occurred in great waves, or it still occurs in great waves underneath the Sahara. So sub-Saharan Africa, a belt called the meningitis belt of A. Now we've got vaccines against C, W, so all the other types, or pretty well all the other types, but there wasn't one against A. It should have been quite easy to make one against A, but who was going to pay for it? The poor countries couldn't pay for it. So Bill Gates, when he, and Bill and I should say Melinda Gates, because I think Melinda's probably, you know, Bill Gates makes the money and she tells him where to spend it properly. But I think they're both amazing people. And they, in the year 2000, said, we are going to spend our billions to try and make the world a better place. And one of the ways we're going to do that is through vaccine development. And so they promoted development of a meningococcal A vaccine that was developed in the United States, where they had the wherewithal, but manufactured in India, where they could do it cheaply and they had really good factories. And they could market it at 50 cents a dose. I mean, that's cheaper than any of the vaccines we use nowadays. And they started to introduce it across sub-Saharan Africa. And they've saved thousands of lives by doing that. So there should have been a vaccine. It's called Menafrivax. And it's a wonderful example of technology and philanthropy working together to overcome poverty. So that to me is an ideal, if we can do something like that. It's an extraordinary story.
Yes, and possibly one that can be repeated, do you think? What would be the next cab on the rank?
So to me, measles is that it still kills, it used to kill 1 million children a year, now kills substantially fewer than that, but it's still, we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of children killed every year by measles. And yet we used to, when I first came to Australia, there were 10 children a year dying from measles. We haven't had a death from measles in Australia for 20, 30 years. We've wiped out measles from Australia, and we ought to be able to do it from the whole world.
Huh.
And so I think measles is the next target, and we can save hundreds of thousands of lives that way.
Right, right. And
I mean,
is there a
Bill and
financial...
Melinda Gates Bill and Melinda Gates, I mean, when you go to their website, you'll see they've saved millions of lives of children who would have died from vaccine-preventable diseases. Yes.
So we're just in the last few minutes, David, and
yeah.
So what reflection would you like to leave your audience with? Your career in immunology, what is your message to the generations of the future?
Look, I mean, I think one of the things I would say, well, look, you're married to the Australia's scientist, you know, and mine is one of science. I think that people through COVID, through pandemics and so on, have come to trust science, or should come to trust science, to try and develop the best vaccines. The history of vaccination is extraordinary, but it's a heroic story, but it's a tragic one as well. So there are tragic stories through this as well as heroic stories, that vaccines have saved millions of lives, and we will eventually, I hope, get a vaccine against COVID. But even the vaccines that we give every year save millions of lives. We can now prevent cancer of the cervix through a vaccine developed by an Australian, Ian Fraser. And, you know, Australia's leading the way on preventing cancer of the cervix through human HPV, human papillomavirus vaccination. So it's a very exciting world to live in, if you like, a very optimistic one from my point of view. I think it's wonderful that we've overcome these diseases. Nature is the world's greatest terrorist. It's a much greater terrorist than any human terrorism. And yet we are trying to, I mean, I don't think we're against nature, but I think we can control nature about some things, and prevention is a great way to do it. So I'm fascinated by immunization. I learned a lot writing this book, and I hope you learn a lot reading it.
Well, I recommend it wholeheartedly as a window to the past and a guide to the present and future. I think you know where to get it from. So with that, I'll bid you all good evening, and thank you very much. Stay safe, stay sane, and see you again.
And thank you, Ella. It was lovely talking to you.
And
thoroughly enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.